Alright, so continuing Dreams, Evolution, and Value Fulfillment by Jane Roberts, a Seth book, Volume 2. So we are still in Master Events and Reality Overlays, but I want to show you that this is session 931. There's only really a few pages of book dictation, but that is how thick it is, because it's mostly notes. I will try to skip as much that is unnecessary so you guys can just get straight to the point of what Seth is trying to convey here. So Jane's symptoms are definitely declining, alright? She has dreams of walking and running, dancing, moving normally, which they see as encouraging. I'm not going to read that whole part, but just want to mention that Jane, amid her incessant questioning as to who or what Seth is, even if he is a master event, and amid her concerns about leading others astray, Jane journaled 4 days later some information that I will read later about Seth being a master event in Jane's words. And then just noting real quick that there will also be later the information that's talked about right here, where Jane has a dream, a reincarnational dream, and awakens it too and writes this down. That will be later also. I will give you guys that. So let me just say, in Rob's notes, he writes, Seth delved into Jane's sinful self from a number of viewpoints. Its birth and growth during her intense relationship with the Roman Catholic Church throughout her earlier years. The development of her very stubborn core beliefs, her creative dilemmas after she left the church in her late teens, the conflict she began to experience after our marriage, involving on the one hand her sinful self and the religion she thought she'd left behind, and on the other hand, science, art, writing, and the unconventional direction she discovered her natural, mystical abilities were taking via the Seth material, her growing fears of leading others astray, and the very real necessity for her and for each individual to achieve value fulfillment. Okay, let me just pause. You guys, imagine what it would be like being Jane. Getting hate mail. This information is just so matter-of-fact and outside of the usual framework that people were living in. I'm sure you can imagine how hard that must have been for her. So, it goes into her early years. Jane had naturally and deeply loved her mother. This is going more into the sinful self. Okay, so Seth discussed Jane's persistent psychological abuse and mistreatment by her mother Marie, and the young girl's reluctant deep fear of abandonment. Jane never lost that fear, and needed frequent reassurances that she was a worthy person. She'd seldom found that reinforcement while living with a parent who had been divorced and bedridden by the time Jane was 3 years old, and who had a host of problems, challenges of her own to meet. Seth told us because of her abusive treatment by Marie, her mother, assuming that it must have been bad, that it deserved all those years of psychological assault. This is why Jane's sinful self even felt guilty. So we're going to go into that. So Rob notes we had a hard time believing him when Seth told us the very next evening that Jane's sinful self thinks her physical symptoms are necessary, quote, for the personality's own good, end quote, and that the self has no conception that its policies have become self-defeating, that following Catholic and non-Catholic Christianity, it believes that suffering is good for the soul. That idea of the flesh itself being graced is, to it, blasphemous. The sinful self. And yet Seth told us, in spite of everything, Jane's sinful self could begin to change once it was reached. Her sinful self, according to Seth, no longer identifies with the church. That self itself has become frightened, in conflict within itself over its early training and Jane's creativity, which it regards as wrong. The creative self is guilty. Jane had panic attacks while sleeping. And Rob also notes that after supper, I discussed with Jane the question I've been keeping in mind for Seth, concerning what her sinful self may have learned since we began this series of sessions. I said it was essential to communicate to her sinful self, so named by Seth for convenience sake only, that its performance has been very destructive to Jane, and that it must release its hold. I want to know that self's attitude toward the fact that Jane is now helpless as far as her physical survival is concerned. She can no longer care of herself without any help. And this obviously implies that if her condition continues to worsen to the point of death, her sinful self will die also. I want to know what it thinks about such a contradictory situation. It meaning the sinful self. If we had been appalled when Seth began giving his version of the beliefs her sinful self held, we were even more so when that self began to express itself personally, in quotes, and once more I had to guard my own expressions of frustration and anger. Then Seth came through with another session on the same subject while Jane's sinful self was in the midst of its own revelations. But she simply had to get that final direct message from that portion of herself by herself, except for that one session. She even made Seth figuratively stand aside while she did so, but Seth himself was delighted with her breakthrough. Jane's own sinful self-revelation certainly complemented Seth's, which in turn we thought were the other side of his material on the magical approach to reality. Okay, I'm about to read in just a sec the sinful self talking, but writing. Jane was tired out when the flow of her material finally ended. "Wow," she said, her eyes red and baffled. I never dreamed that I had all of that inside me." End quote by Jane. Okay, so Jane had begun writing for her sinful self this way, with my insertions and brackets. Rob's. Quote, this is what Jane writes. "I resent the designation unjustly given me, for if I have believed in the phenomenon of sin and sought apparently too rigidly to avoid it, my intentions and interests always were not the avoidance of sin so much as the pursuit of eternal truths, the alliance with universal goals, the unity in spirit at least of self, whole self, and universal mind. These goals ignite your creative powers and have, and still do, propel you to explore all categories of existence possible, seeking to express those divine mysteries that lie within and behind each existence, yours and mine as well. Our explorations involved no second-handed evidence handed down by others, but the direct personal encounter of our consciousness and being with the vast elements of the unknown. A meeting of the self, human and vulnerable, with the psychological realms of gods and eternities, giant realms of mind that our nature felt attracted to and was uniquely equipped to perceive. I believed in the soul's survival first of all, and inspired the creative self to step out as freely as possible, even while in my heart I also believed in the existence of sin and devil. I felt upon my heart the heavy, unkind mark of Cain, sensing that humanity carries, unfairly, the almost indelible strain, the tragic flaw of being tinged by sin and ancient iniquities. Thusly, I reasoned, if I am flawed, I must automatically distort even those experiences of the soul that seem clearest. I must unwittingly fall into error when I trust myself the most, since I share that sinful propensity. Yet despite those feelings, did we, unswervingly set forward. End quote from Jane's Sinful Self. Rob notes, we studied her own Sinful Self material as she typed it. Again and again we scrutinized all of those elements that we thought were bound up in her symptoms. Choice, fear of abandonment, and the need for self-protection, penance, and the controversial nature of her gifts. Okay, keep in mind, that was not all that the Sinful Self wrote. That was just a piece they just gave right there. Okay, so before this session, Jane reminded Rob that she was most interested in Seth commenting upon the reincarnational type dream she'd experienced. All right, now back to master events and reality overlays. Seth comes in. He says, time overlays are versions of master events, in that they occur in such a fashion that one, quote, face of an overall event may appear in one time, one in another, and so forth. Time overlays are the time versions of certain events, then. These time overlays always exist. They may become activated, however, by certain associations made in your present, and therefore draw into your present time some glimpses either from the future or the past. So-called present time is thickened, then, by a psychological realization on deep levels of the psyche that all events are interrelated, and that the reincarnational experiences of any given individual provide a rich source of experience from which each person, at least, unconsciously draws. Such usually unconscious knowledge is of great benefit to the species itself, so that at certain levels at least, the knowledge of the species is not imprisoned within any given generation at once, but flows or circulates within the overall larger reincarnational picture. Probabilities are very much involved here, of course. And it is easier for particular events to fall within one time sequence than another. I do not want you to feel that you are fated to experience certain events, however, for that is not the case. There will be, quote, offshoots of the events of your own lives, however, that may appear as overlays in your other reincarnational existences. There are certain points where such events are closer to you than others, in which mental associations at any given time may put you in correspondence with other events of a similar nature in some future or past incarnation, however. It is truer to say that those similar events are instead time versions of one larger event. As a rule, you experience only one time version of any given action. Certainly, it is easy to see how a birthday or anniversary or particular symbol or object might serve as an associative connection, rousing within you memories of issues or actions that might have happened under similar circumstances in other times. Actually, that kind of psychological behavior represents the backbone of social organization as far as the species is concerned, and it is the usually hidden but definite past and future memories of reincarnational relationships that cement social organizations, from small tribes to large governments. To a certain extent, of course, you have been or will be each related to the other. In that light, all of the events of time rub elbows together. You brush against the elbow of a future or past event every moment of your lives. In the culture that you know, such information remains hidden from you. Your main belief systems lead you to feel that your present life is singular, unsupported by any knowledge of prior experience with existence, and fated to be cut off or dead-ended without a future. Instead, you always carry the inner knowledge of innumerable available futures. Your emotional life at certain levels is enriched by the unconscious realization that those who love you from past or future are connected to you by special ties that add to your emotional heritage and support. As many have supposed, particularly in fiction, love relationships do indeed survive time, and they put you in a special correspondence. Even if you were aware of reincarnational existences, your present psychological behavior would not be threatened, but retain its prominence. For only within certain space and time intersections can physical actions occur. The more or less general acceptance of the theory of reincarnation, however, would automatically alter your social systems, add to the richness of experience, and in particular, insert a fresh feeling for the future, so that you did not feel your lives dead-ended. Earlier, I mentioned several times that we must reach a point at which you are able to see around the corner of seemingly contradictory material, and this is one of those occasions. Time overlays present you with a picture in which you have free will, yet each event that you choose will have its own time version. Now, those time versions may be entirely different one from the others, and while you certainly initiate your own time version, in terms of usual understanding, there is no true place or time in which that version can be said to actually originate. Such a time version suggests an occurrence in time, of course, and yet the event may leave only a ghostly track, so to speak, being hardly manifest, while in another life the time version may be of considerable prominence, while in your own experience it represents a fairly trivial incident of an ordinary afternoon. The inner core of events, however, is held together by just that kind of activity. You are at every hand provided an unending source of probable events from past and future, from which to compose the events of your lives and society. Again, let me remind you that all time exists simultaneously. In an experience last evening in the dream state, Rupert received fresh evidence by viewing for himself portions of 2 other lives, merely snatches of environment, but so dearly filled with precious belongings and loved ones, so alive with immediacy, that he was shocked to realize that the full dimensions of existence could continue so completely in such detail and depth at the same time as his present life. It seemed that he could step from any one such existence to the other, as you might walk from one room to the other, and he knew that at other levels of the psyche this was indeed possible. And, of course, at other levels of the psyche, those psychological doors are open. Rupert has had particular difficulty, however, with, quote, the theory of reincarnation, end quote, because, as it is usually described, it seemed that people used it to blame as the source of current misfortune, or as an excuse for personal behavior whose nature they did not otherwise understand, and it has been so maligned. Its reality, however, serves to generate activity throughout time's framework as you understand it, to unite the species, to reinforce structures of knowledge, to transmit information, and perhaps most of all, to reinforce relationships involving love, brotherhood, and cooperation between generations of men and women that would otherwise be quite separate and apart from each other. Through such relationships, for example, say the cavemen and the people of the 22nd century rub elbows, where, in strict terms of time, the species would seem to be quite disconnected from its, quote, earlier or, quote, later counterparts. Through such behavior, the overall value, fulfillment, purposes, and intents of the species are kept in focus, and those necessary requirements then planted in whatever space or time is required. Again, free will still operates in all such ventures. Now, while it seems that your world contains more and more information all the time, your particular brand of science is a relatively narrow one, in that it accepts as valid only certain specific areas of speculation. The areas outside of its boundaries become taboo, so that the realm of the unknown is no longer the material universe or the mysteries of space, but the interior universe and the mysteries of the mind, as these are experienced or suspected to exist outside of those official areas. To that degree, the unknown is more feared by science than it ever was by religion. Religion was hampered, and is, by its own interpretation of good and evil. But it did not deny the existence of other versions of consciousness, or different kinds of psychological activity in life. Reincarnation suggests, of course, the extension of personal existence beyond one time period, independently of one bodily form, the translation or transmission of intelligence through non-physical frameworks, and implies psychological behavior, memory, and desire as purposeful action without the substance of any physical mechanism. Propositions that science, at its present stage of development, simply could not buy, and for which it could find no evidence. For its methods would automatically preclude the type of experience that such evidence would require. People can become quite frightened then of any kind of experiences of a personal nature that imply reincarnational life, for they are then faced with the taboos of science, or perhaps by the distorted explanations of some religions or cults. You therefore protect yourselves from many quite natural upthrusts that would on their own give you experience with your own reincarnational existences, and you are often denied psychological comfort in times of stress that you might otherwise receive. I do not necessarily mean that full-blown pictures of other existences would necessarily come into your mind, but that in one way or another you would receive a support or change of mood as those loved by you in other lives, in one way or another, sensed your need and responded. The entire nature of events, then, exists in a different way than you have supposed, only small portions slicing into the reality that you recognize, yet all underneath connected to a vast psychological activity. You might compare events to psychological consonants that underlay or underlie the more unusual features of physical, psychological environment. So that was the end of session 931. And there are many notes as I showed you. Now, if you want to hear the notes, then just keep listening. But I'm not going to read them all. Let me just give you like an overview. Note number one. This is basically Jane realizing how much goes into just typing, just using your fingers, and the flexibility, the physical vigor. And then rather strongly emotionally, it came to me that I thought it my duty to clamp down physically, to cut down mobility in order to have mobility as a writer. So let me pause. She is explaining part of why she has these symptoms, okay? Now, she says, have mobility as a writer, that is to sit down, cut down on impulses, distractions, to make sure I do my work, pursue my goals undeviatingly. That new book contracts instantly led me to that kind of behavior, and that I really see that such behavior, carried to its extremes, would end up smothering my writing, defeating the purposes it seemingly meant to protect. But I did fear that impulses and body motion were distractions to work. Now I see how much impulses are conducive to just typing. For God's sake, imagine typing and seeing with ease, just thinking about what I'm thinking about instead of trying to get my fingers on the proper keys. I feel as if I'm on to something here, feel some relaxation. If this is the case, the entire process could be changed around quite quickly, of course, toward mobility. I'm not writing here tonight about the reasons behind such behavior, many ideas, but did want to get something down now. From Note 2, Jane's nature has even led me to speculate more than once that in most basic terms, she may be visiting our probable reality from one that's actually far more native to her non-physical entity or whole self. I don't mean that as a physical creature she has magically switched temporal realities, but that she's closely allied with that version of herself in that other reality. I'm going into Note 3, which I'm not reading all of. Rob states that this is a slightly abridged from Jane's journal for 1980, with his interpolations in brackets. Jane writes, quote, "Yesterday, while checking the page proofs for mass events, I got the feeling that that book really bothered me, served as a focal point. My eye trouble started the same spring that Seth started dictating it in 1977. I was doing my worldview book on William James, and those people were picketing Prentice Hall's offices in New York City because of the Seth material. The fact had escaped me earlier that mass events represented Seth's and my direct attack on official dictums, or so it seemed to me. Before, we sort of did it by inference. I accept everything in the book, but I think I felt that if I was going to tell it like it was, and I was determined to, then I also needed more protection from the world, and began cutting down mobility again. My idea is that the eyes get bad after the muscular strain reaches a certain point. The idea of protection also came back after reading a book on William James that a friend gave us for Christmas. James's attitudes and mine so often seemed similar that he was determined to be daring, press ahead no matter what, explore consciousness, while at the same time being attracted to safety, disliking controversy, wanting peace, etc. I think I am that way. The long breaks when Seth didn't dictate bookwork may have come when I got particularly concerned about the material, the wisdom of presenting it to the world. In fact, Seth gave us Framework 1 and 2 stuff in there to help me. I did grab hold several times with the God of Jane book, the new inspiration there, and the material on following impulses made some very good improvements. But far more than Rob from the beginning, I was nervous and anxious about directly coming out with many of the ideas, which at the same time I fervently and even passionately believe in. I may fear that if you go too far, telling it like it is, that the establishment will just cut off your platform, or that people will stop buying your books, something like that, biting the hand that feeds you. You can only go so far. Yet I've always known that these ideas conflicted with official ones. It's just that earlier our attack was less direct. Lately, I've been working with ideas of safety, saying and believing that I am safe, secure, and supported, and that I do trust my natural, spontaneous motion. Now, as I write, some old dumb stuff comes emotionally to mind. My mother saying that I destroy those I loved, or some such nonsense. But it's as if I always felt that spontaneously, left alone, I'd end up taking away people's comfort blankets, and I felt bad about that, even while I knew that those philosophic blankets were warmy, had to go. And I do see that I'm offering something far better. Okay, we're about to go into James' journal on Seth being a master event.